Hi, and welcome to this LinkedIn Live. This is the sixth in an 8-part series. We've got Bill Sherman as our guest here today from Thought Leadership Leverage. And you guys, this is going to be very critical for you if you're in those stages of your work where you're trying to craft what is your thought leadership framework? What's that proprietary model? And I know there's a lot of you that have this in your mind and it's weighing on you because I've been talking to you about this in the last number of weeks, which is why I've brought Bill on today. He's so generously joining us, and I'm really, really thankful for it. Hi, Bill. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, thanks for joining. Okay, let's buzz through these first little bits, so then right to the good stuff. Stick be about a half an hour, unless we're just so involved in this that we have to talk. Okay, so I want to just remind you that this is all part of the Prepare to Launch series, which is leading up to a course booster bootcamp that I'm running in April. We'll talk more about that. I don't want this to be a sales pitch by any means. But we also do have a follow-up webinar coming up at the end of March 31st at noon. And we're talking there about how to take all of these great ideas you have and make you feel inspired as to what a passive income model could look like to build out those offers. And we're really talking about a 4-course module and the potential for that within your business. So don't miss that at the end of the month. Again, we've got Bill Sherman here. Today we're going to be I'm going to cover what we just talked about the last number of weeks, where we've been preparing ourselves for this brand new course concept. How do you validate that idea you have before you dive in? Can you pre-sell a course before you make it? Who's this buyer versus our learner? And like, how do we position our brand and build out this content structure? And today we're just digging more into this thought leadership creation. So today we're going to work with Bill and talk about his 4 elements of thought leadership, how to apply this to our own content, and how we can use this as a foundation for a course potentially, or your training, or your articles, your podcast, blogs, etc. And what should all of us content creators have in place before we start barging ahead and how do we refine what we've been talking about? I have a free download for you. We're going to be jumping over to a worksheet as Bill brings some examples, and I will capture that live for you here. If you want that worksheet, stay tuned to the end. We're going to give you the link for that. All right. So I'm your host, Manya. I'm a facilitator, former corporate trainer, freelance curriculum designer, and now I'm helping entrepreneurs create online learning offers that are structured to deliver satisfaction, drive learner engagement, and get you business results. Well, it's really well aligned to the business model that you want to have for your own business, and that would be most suited for your audience. And over to Bill, who's joined us today. And I feel like I've already taken up too much time. So, Bill, over to you to please introduce yourself and let the audience know what you're all about.
Hi, so I'm Bill Sherman. I'm the COO of Thought Leadership Leverage. And we'll get into a question of what is thought leadership and leverage in a moment. But really, my background has been for the last 20 years taking ideas to scale. I've worked with individuals and organizations, so academics at business schools, top tier Ivy League. I've worked with C-level executives, both Fortune 500 and then startup, as well as the boutique consultancies. They have a unique point of view or an expertise, and they're trying to take something to scale. Then on the organizational side, nonprofits and for-profit entities that really are facing the question, what is thought leadership? How
Mhm.
do we use it effectively? And where is our unique point of view for our messaging?
So crucial. All right. I'm excited because I think that a lot of people on this call, I know from my audience, they have an idea for a course or they already have one and they're constantly thinking of new offers, whether it be, I want to take this into corporate training, or I want to create something that's more passive. I want to, build a membership or launch. There's all these out of the box ways of thinking about presenting your content. And so a lot of you on this call, this is part of your vision for your business. So what would your life look like if you already had this ready to go and created? And this is such a foundational building block as part of that journey for you. So, Bill, tell me, what is thought leadership? Obviously, this is your wheelhouse. This is the area that your whole business is based on. So,
Mhm.
I think we all have different ideas of what this means. And I'm sure you have a really strong perspective on this topic.
So I do, but I'll also acknowledge that if you were to either take a random sample of business professionals or even thought leadership practitioners, you'd get different definitions. Here's what I use. Thought leadership is the process of looking around the corner into the future, into the many possible futures, if you will, and then sorting through the signal and the noise and identifying what's going to be of value to your audience. Then you bring that insight back, you share it with them, and you leave them with the clear next step. Okay. Now, that's not the next step that you want them to take because it's good for you, but it's the next step that's essential for them. Right. And
Hmm.
sometimes, depending on how far you're looking to the future, could be 6 months, could be a year. Some organizations are looking 7, 10 years out. Right. And so you've got to break that next step down into something that's simple and actionable because we're all really busy at this point
I
and we
know.
have many things floating through our heads.
Right. And there's so much distraction. We can get
Mhm.
bebopping into a bunch of different areas, even in this, if you're a creative person or curious and you're just looking all over the map. So, why should we, as, business owners, content creators, maybe we're writers or bloggers or podcasters or trainers, why should we care about um, being very conscious about focusing on our thought leadership? And what should
So,
we know about this? Like, what should we
yeah,
keep
so
in
there are
mind?
there are a couple things. One, if you think about thought leadership, it's the art of being deeply irrelevant to many people. And you might
Mm.
stop and say, "Well, wait a minute." But let me use an example. So, if you look at the population of people that's on LinkedIn,
Hmm.
there are 760, 770 million people on LinkedIn. And it is very hard to be deeply relevant. I don't know how I could be relevant to all 770 million,
Yeah.
right? And so the first step that you have to do is a process of letting go and say, I have an idea, but instead of trying to make it useful for everyone, I'm going to focus on this small, narrow population where they can see value to them
Hmm.
and I can be deeply relevant to them, right? And so 99.99% of the world won't understand, care, or be interested in your message. And that's okay
Yeah.
because there are a lot of people in the world.
So niching down is incredibly important, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. And when you do thought leadership right, it has the effect that it feels like for your audience, you're in the room speaking to them, whether or not you're there. So, for example, it is very common that someone will look at a piece of content in thought leadership that you put out and say, "Were you in that last meeting that I was in? Do you have my office bugged?" Those are the things I've been talking about with my team or with my colleagues over the past few weeks. You know exactly what's going on in my world.
And
And
so,
the
yeah,
only way you can get to that.
that was what I was going to say. How do we get to that? How do we feel like we know their pain points and their desires so deeply that we're in the room with them?
So some of that is listening, more of it is becoming part of a community, right?
Yeah.
And so if you think of your target audience as a group that you're talking to or at, it doesn't work. Thought leadership is two-way communication, and it doesn't mean that you're monologuing. You have
Hmm.
to join the conversation, be willing to advance others' good ideas, and listen to other successes and pain points. And if you're not devoting a decent part of your time listening to your audience, you're going to be off base.
Yeah. It's going to be like blasting people with a megaphone, but not really having that listening ear, and that's super important. And, for this audience, people who are, in the course creation space, I use that broadly.
Mhm.
You have to be still at the same, you have to keep figuring out ways to keep yourself at the level that they are when they start. Your students, right? You have to stay in that mind frame. You can't be years and years ahead of them always, so it is really important to be in that space, hear what's going on, empathize with where they're currently at this beginning of the journey, and always stay relevant and connected. And that can get harder as you become further removed, you know, um, from your
Absolutely.
audience.
It's the curse of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So in thought leadership, a couple things happen. One, if you found a topic that you're passionate about and that you love thinking about, evenings, weekends, it's constantly percolating in your head, you wind up advancing your thinking further and further.
Hmm.
The problem is your audience hasn't taken up space inside of your head and started living there. And so I've worked with clients on thought leadership where maybe they're working on a speech or that introductory program, and they say, okay, what are the things that I can give that will add value? And
Hmm.
I often pick out some of the most fundamental things in their content. And I remember one time I live here in Vegas, and I was
Okay. Yeah.
walking with a client, down the strip, and I had met him on the strip, and he was like, "Okay, what do I put in the content?" And I said, "Okay, here are your 3 fundamental things." He's like, "Really? I've
Yeah.
been
Like it's
thinking
so
about that for
basic.
10 years. Won't they be disappointed?" And it's like, they haven't been thinking about it for 10 years. You need to get them to see these things. Otherwise, everything else that you say afterwards won't make sense.
Yeah. And it's so important. And I use this as a check myself as well, because it's like I'm years and years and years ahead on the journey. They're just
Mhm.
thinking that this is an idea, or they might be, a couple of flops in. And it's like, oh no, is this even worth doing? And how do I move ahead? So I love that. Really important to niche down. It's important to be part of that community, understand the pain and the needs and the desires of your audience, and don't be afraid to be at that beginner level for them, or at the fundamental or foundational level.
So I'll provide another example, and maybe after this chat, we can put in a link somewhere as
Mhm.
well. So Wired Magazine does a video series, and they've done it for a couple years now, where they take an expert in a field, usually a PhD in a very obscure field. The most recent one, I think, was around zero knowledge proofs and blockchain, which
Right.
is something where I don't know much about. But
Mhm.
what they do is they explain the concept at 5 levels. One, they have the expert explain it to a grade school student,
Mhm.
then a high school student, then a college student, a graduate student, and then finally someone who is their peer, right?
Okay.
And if you watch this, how does the expert use props, visuals, etc., to explain what is a very abstract and complex idea to an 8-year-old? And I
Mhm.
think one of the things that we need to do is we want to play at the graduate school level of our idea, or the thing that has me jazzed that I'm thinking at night. But we've got to dial it down and say, no, this is grade school or high school that I need to start at.
That's a great analogy. Maybe we can include that link,
Absolutely.
afterwards
It's a
for people.
fantastic series and addictive to watch. I think there's
I'm
16
looking
or so
forward
of
to
them.
that. And it's Wired, did you say?
Yeah, it's Wired
Yeah,
Magazine and it's on
cool.
YouTube.
We'll check that out. Awesome. All right. I love this. Now let's get into some explanation about the actual framework process itself. And this is your model. I'm going to see if I
Mhm.
can move our little
Okay.
faces around, because it's kind of blocking. Um, oops, that didn't work. Let me try again. Sorry about that.
There
Okay,
we go.
go ahead. Let's talk about your framework here.
So what this framework is for people who want to create thought leadership. And let's pause for a moment and say, we've been talking about courses so far. I describe a course as a form of offering in thought
Hmm.
leadership. And an offering is as simple as, how will people encounter your ideas, right? Now, some offerings come with a price tag, others you give away for free. This this interview and this conversation is an offering. It's a way for people to encounter ideas. A LinkedIn
Yeah.
post, a podcast, all of those are offerings, right?
Hmm.
But let's start in the upper left. And let's
Okay.
start with the question of what's an idea? An idea isn't a book, it isn't a chapter in a book. It's often something very simple. It can be summed up in a sentence or two, and it's designed to have someone say, "Oh, okay, that's a different take on something. Tell me more." If you reach the tell me more point, you've succeeded with the idea. You don't have to prove your idea to your audience. You merely need to summarize it to them. Okay.
Okay. So, do you have an example here we can work through? I've got this worksheet here that I will be presenting to people to grab at the end. So, do you have an example? Do you want me to give you an example, or do you have one in your head of something we could work through?
So I have one in my mind.
Okay, great.
So, yeah. So let's talk about something from Stephen Covey's Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, right?
Yep.
And he talks about the difference between important and urgent, and that we often get trapped, and actually comes from Eisenhower, but Covey popularizes it, that we focus on the important over the urgent, right?
I think it's H.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so that's an idea that he
And it's a
has.
2 by 2
Yeah.
matrix, right?
Okay. So that would be the idea if you look at
Mhm.
his concept. All right. So
And an idea
did you want
can be a term, it can be a
mhm.
graph, it can be a chart. Sometimes I have seen people Blue Ocean Strategy, which is another book that's
Yep.
out there, which is possible very popular. Blue Ocean Strategy talks about red oceans and blue oceans, right?
Mhm.
And don't try to build a business in a red ocean. Again, that's another example of an idea that you haven't defined what is a blue ocean, what is a
Mhm.
red ocean, how do I get involved in it, but you've presented a concept. Okay.
Okay. Okay, great. So let's zip over to your next which is I think it's platform. Oops. You saw my kids
So
there.
let's go over to the right since that's what you have set up. We can go through this anyway, any of the ways because they
Okay.
all are linked by strategy. But since you have platform next on your form, let's talk
Okay.
about this, right? Sometimes people start thought leadership with an idea. They've got something they want to say. Other times they start with a platform, but I think for most people, the platform is the harder piece
Hmm.
for people to lock down. It's not quite the elevator pitch, it's the summary of what your content is about, right? So let's say you're creating a course on leadership, for example. Great. Who's it for? Why should they care? And what's the benefit? Let's stay on a platform. Let's stay with Stephen Covey. Okay.
Mhm.
Stephen Covey's platform was also the title of his first book, Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. It's a very clearly written platform in that there's a couple key words that stand out. If you want to be highly effective, this platform is for you, right? Also, it's not that highly effective people are blessed with some magical skills at birth. They are habits. Those are things that you can learn. Okay. And there's discrete number of them. 7.
And I don't know why my video just
Okay.
disappeared. I'm here.
Okay.
There's too many
So
things, screens and everything.
you almost need someone helping you off stage
I
managing.
know.
Yeah.
I know.
But 7 habits of highly effective leadership identifies that the platform is for leaders or for
Mhm.
people who want to become leaders. They are skills that are learnable and that it's manageable. It's not that I'm asking you 101 skills to master. There are 7.
Yeah. So this is sort of that broader framework, as it were, that encompasses all of the ideas and content into that summary. Is
Absolutely.
that
The
correct?
the platform is the overarching idea that or the overarching framework
Mhm.
where you can hang ideas off of. It also, as a platform, allows you to remain evergreen
Mm.
because there are different phases of business cycles.
Mhm.
I think back to 2006, for example. If you were to walk into a bookstore in 2006, and I'm dating myself now here, with both bookstores and that, but a number of the books in the business bookshelf were about happiness. Okay.
Mhm.
There was Gretchen Rubin's Happiness Project. There was Daniel Gilbert stumbling on happiness. Okay. And people were looking for happiness, fulfillment, and meaning. And then in 2008, the economy turned sour,
Mhm.
and we had what we called the Great Recession then, right? And so if you looked at the business bookshelf then, there was grit, there was resilience, and there was a seasonality. And so what you want to be able to do is to pick a platform which will be evergreen rather than seasonal so that you don't have to reposition your thought leadership every time the market changes.
Makes sense. I mean, looking at Stephen Covey's example, 7 Habits of Highly Effective Leaders, that he probably was putting out a lot of information over the pandemic,
Mhm.
related to all the things leaders had to do to manage remote workforces and deal with chaos
Well,
and
Stephen
whatever.
Covey died several years ago, but
Oh,
his
sorry,
son,
that
Stephen
he would
M.R.
have then.
Yeah, yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah. His
The
son
framework lives
obviously has been
on.
active.
Or the platform lives on, right? And
Mhm.
that's part of that evergreen
Well, and if you
concept.
think even Dan Pink, for example, has a number of books that come out. One I'm thinking of as a platform as well, To Sell is Human,
Mhm.
right? It's one of his enduring books and platforms, and that doesn't have a seasonal component or a business cycle component. It identifies who it's for, not just salespeople, but that sales is an essential part of everything that we do. Okay. And
Yeah.
so that's how it wound up having a broad reach, but also be evergreen.
Hmm. Very interesting. All right, so we need to cycle back to content.
Mhm.
I kind of diverted us in a way.
No
So talk to
worries.
us about how do we get from idea, to content to platform?
So, content is your library of stories, data, and examples that you use to explain an idea. Okay. Remember that I said the idea is only enough to get someone to say, aha, I see the
Mhm.
world differently. Great. Now you have to explain it, support it, prove it.
Mhm.
Now, if you're speaking to C-level executives one day, maybe in manufacturing at a conference, the stories, data, and examples that you might use for a keynote speech would be different than if you were presenting the same idea to frontline salespeople, for example, right? And so your entire content library, as you go through, keeps growing. If you read an article online, you're like, oh, that's a good example. You put it in your content library. Someone
Mhm.
tells you a good story, that goes into your content library. Now, some people's content libraries are sort of like the junk drawer that we all have in our kitchen, where it's unsorted, unorganized, and hard to find anything, and you wind up tearing it all apart. Other people and successful thought leaders as practitioners have sorted it so they know when they're speaking to a specific audience what is most likely to get them to say, okay, I agree with you. You have permission to show me how to do this.
Okay, I'm a huge fan of organization. I use Notion
Hmm.
software to keep my content organized, to keep everything organized. I felt like I had all this stuff everywhere and I couldn't just keep it in my head. I needed an external brain, a place to hold my stuff.
Mhm.
Mine is really sorted based on like the pillars or the framework of my business. But do you recommend a way to sort this? You mentioned by audience. Is that a great way, or do you think it really depends on the person?
It depends on the person and whom they're trying to reach.
Hmm.
So, for thought leadership, one of the things that I strongly advocate, and we'll get into this in offerings, it's easy to fall into a trap where you focus on the container and the package rather than the message, right?
Hmm.
And so I describe it similar as my cats love boxes from Amazon. I take the thing out of the box when it comes. They'll
Hmm.
play with the box for hours or days, right?
Hmm.
Thought leadership can be dangerous like that. So if you have a weekly podcast, or if you have a monthly newsletter, or anything that has a regular cadence, you start saying, what am I going to put into this container? Right. And the container takes precedence over your audience and what do they need and how are you going to be relevant to them? Remember, I said thought leadership is the art of being deeply irrelevant and then deeply relevant. Once you're talking to your audience, you've got to cherry pick your stories, data, and examples to make sure that you're targeted to them. And that's both true in course design as
Hmm.
well as then when you're positioning your ideas out into the world from a thought leadership or a marketing perspective.
I think that's really important because, yeah, we can get hung up on like, oh, it's my weekly podcast. What am I going to say? And sometimes
Exactly.
you have no problem coming up with content, and other times you feel like you're forcing it a little bit. So it's a good reminder that, like,
Or
focus
other
on the audience.
times, you're talking about something that you're absolutely interested in, but your audience doesn't see the connection or could care less,
Right.
right? And then
Okay.
it's like a cat playing with a ball of string. You're entertained, but nobody else is.
Yep. I love the cat analogy. I have kids who are sort of equal to cats.
Mhm. Yeah.
A toddler
At
is
at a
he's
similar
basically
age,
like
there's a
a
lot of
cat. Yeah.
similarity. Yeah. Okay.
All right. So we've talked about offerings, and I know like so these three things often are overlooked, I think, by
Mhm.
many people in the space, and they jump straight to offer, like, oh, here's what I can
Absolutely.
do. And
Mhm.
so I love this. I'm always kind of drawing people away from the obvious and going, okay, let's go back. Let's take a step back. Let's look at the needs of our learners. Let's look at, their journey. This is about them and their journey. So I love that your model is really doing that. It's taking that step back. But now we're here at the offering stage. So talk to us about this.
So the way that I think about offerings is how will your audience encounter your idea? Whether or not they're exchanging money, they're always exchanging time,
Mhm.
right? And so think about how we all encounter ideas on social media.
Mhm.
We scroll past. If it
Yep.
doesn't catch our attention in the first 3 to 5 seconds, we're gone. We move
Yep.
on, right? And so you have to find ways. It used to be in the old world that you could write a book, you could write a white paper, people would sit down and read it. Now you have to sort of flip that model and say the book, the white paper, the long form course, right? Those are all after you've received permission for more of their attention, right? And so learning to work, certainly from an instructional design perspective or a marketing perspective, within a 60 to 90-second framework is tough,
Mhm.
right? And I think some of the most effective examples of this are if you look at YouTube, for example,
Yep.
right? It's a pull based model. If my sink is leaking, I will search, the model or the manufacturer, and I'm looking for that video. Recently,
Mhm.
I had a dishwasher break, and I couldn't open the dishwasher door, and I had clean dishes inside. So the first thing I went to was YouTube, and I
Yeah.
searched dishwasher door stuck.
How do I
Right?
open this thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I needed 60 seconds of a video
Uh-huh.
and I was able to solve it, right?
Yeah.
That was the distilling down of an idea to its bare essentials, right?
Mhm.
And you can't put everything into that narrow first, almost like an amuse bouche if you're going to a fancy restaurant. It's that
Mhm.
little appetizer, it's that little taste
Mhm.
that if someone likes it, they'll want more. The other
So,
thing on an offering you have to
mhm.
remember is you can't assume that people have been following your conversation and your work serially, right? I've seen people use LinkedIn almost as if they're writing chapters of the book when they post. I'm like, nobody's seen that. The algorithm's not
No.
being present for you, nor are we paying attention. This is not how the world works anymore. We're not Charles Dickens writing novels and publishing them in magazines in the 19th century.
Yeah, it's everything's gotta be able to grab and be relevant for people, and this is the tricky part, right? This is what
Right.
I think right now can make you feel like you're just all over the map and super disorganized or really clear. So do you have a process that you kind of would recommend in, under 5 minutes somebody go through, or do you think that they should just really be aware of each area of their strategy? So like, yeah, if somebody's like, "Okay, I wanna just get some of these thoughts down out of my head," what process do you suggest for them?
So there's a couple ways to do it. One would be imagine yourself at a cocktail party, right?
Mhm.
Equip yourself with a napkin and a pen. You can draw one 2 by 2 diagram. You can scribble on that napkin, whatever you want, but you basically have that, was it 3 by 3 sort of square of the napkin? That's your prop. How do you explain your idea in 60 to 90 seconds in a way that someone goes, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more. Rather than they look and they go, I'm going to go check the bar and get a refill, or hey, it looks like they refreshed the food. I'll be back in a bit, and they never
Yeah.
return.
Yeah, yeah,
Right?
yeah. So it's really that attention grabber or that hook.
It's that attention grabber
Mhm.
and that ability to distill down
Mhm.
into the core of the idea. And it takes a lot of work to be able
Mhm.
to do that distillation process.
Mhm.
Another thing that I often recommend as you're trying to figure out what your platform is, is you have to know who your audience is.
Yeah.
Who will be your economic buyer? Who are you selling to? Are you going B2B? Are you
Mhm.
going B2C? Are you selling into the Fortune 500? Are you selling mid cap? Are you selling to entrepreneurs? And are you selling into HR and learning and development executives? Each of those folks need a different approach from sales.
Mhm.
And what I would say is it's a risk to define your thought leadership without thinking about sales.
Mm.
Because my fear is you design a course or you design something and they look and they go, "Oh, that's great, but we really wish you had built it for X, Y, or Z." And
Yeah.
so I'm a believer in do as minimum of a prototype as you can for an offering, do it lean, even if it's the equivalent of an architect's watercolors, saying, hey, if I had something like this for this problem and this idea, would it be interesting to you? And
Yeah.
get feedback. Because if you don't get feedback from the market before you build it, you will certainly get feedback from the market after you
After
build
you
it.
build it, and it'll be a big flop, and we've talked
Yeah, and
about
it's a
that actually
110,
in
100. Yeah,
yeah, and we've actually talked about that in prior, um, Monday afternoon live streams because it's sort of the foundation, right? You've gotta validate that idea early on, and you've gotta keep validating and iterating and staying in that constant feedback loop.
absolutely.
Um, Yeah, I think like, the content areas example too. And I think the key here to take action is like, what have you already got? Can you sort it and organize and kind of
Mhm.
take stock of what you already have? That's going to be my takeaway from this is to go back and make sure that I've really narrowed it down and I've organized it so that it's easier for me to grab and use when I'm speaking with different audiences. And the
Well, and when your
offerings, like,
content
yeah.
library is
Hmm.
sorted, it also becomes easier for others. So as a business grows,
Hmm.
then it's not all in your head. Other people can create derivatives of those assets. They can start handling your social media. They
Hmm.
can create a blog or an article based on stories that are documented.
Yeah.
You don't have to be the one to write the case studies.
Yeah. No, and exactly. Like if you want it, that was why I switched to Notion,
Mhm.
personally, because I'm like, I am not wanting to be running a business all by myself. So let's hurry up and figure out right now how to make sure we can bring people on. And I've got, 5 people working with me now. And if we didn't have that, it would not work.
It quickly becomes a barrier to scale
Hmm.
if you're the only one with the ideas inside your head.
Yep. You get stuck. All right, Bill. What else would you like to leave us with before we kind of wrap up these last 2 minutes?
So, the thing that I'd like to leave people with is thought leadership is a practice rather than a gold star or a check mark, right? It is something where you can talk about the four elements of thought leadership in a simple framework like this. And I've got more documentation on my LinkedIn if you want to dive into that.
Hmm.
But the thing is, it's something that if you keep this mindset, sort of like yoga or meditation as a practice, and you say, I'm going to get better at serving my audience, at communicating ideas to the people who need them so that they can act. Remember the way that I define thought leadership is taking ideas to scale and equipping people with the information they need today so they can take their next step. That's a hard challenge,
Hmm.
and you make mistakes along the way. And so, what you need to be able to do is say, okay, I'm going to practice it today. I will learn more and I will be better tomorrow.
Awesome. It's like a garden. You have to cultivate it.
Absolutely.
You have to weed it, prune it, and, snip the beautiful blooms as it comes to life. If you'd like to continue, I'm switching to the listeners now. If you'd like to continue developing your own personal journey, to build out this clear brand and thought leadership, you definitely need to have a conversation with Bill. Reach out to him through his LinkedIn. And if you are wanting to take an offer and create something that people can learn from, I would love to connect with you in addition to this, because that's what I do. I support entrepreneurs with creating learning that's more engaging, more in line to what their learner needs. And you can keep moving forward on your own. Absolutely. There's lots of information available, but you could run the risk of being in the same place next year, still with big messy thoughts and ideas in your head and no course, no training offer. You could, but get an expert in your corner supporting you and helping you. So follow along with both Bill and I and see if there's anything that stands out. And if you'd like some more support, please do reach out. Of course, we have lots of ways to work with you as we are service providers. Um, and this is my quotable. I find early on people can feel a little bit insecure and like, crumbs, like I should be able to create something myself. Like, what's my problem? I see everybody doing this. Don't be offended, if you don't have it all perfect yet. We've been doing this work for decades and we have deep experience and education, training, so don't be offended by where you're at. Be excited about the potential that you have, the creativity and the guts to move forward. And please do reach out. I'll remind you that if you're interested in this webinar, please let me know. And join here Monday live at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we're continuing to have awesome discussions like these as you're preparing yourself for creating an offer that's going to have high impact for your audience and your learner. And download the worksheet that we were working on, boostld.com/livestream_worksheet. You can take advantage of that and you can do it. We're not super special. We just are organized. We have well proven processes to work through. And we'd love to be supporting you in this journey as well. There's no cost to book with Bill and I. But what is the cost of not having a follow-up conversation with us? It could be really high for you in your business, in your place of employment. So connect with Bill on LinkedIn and connect with myself on LinkedIn if we're not already. And we'd love to have you in our spaces to continue learning from you and what matters to you most. Thanks again, Bill.
Absolutely. Thank you, Manya.
All right. Take care, everybody.